So those of you who have been with us, please bear with me 2 more times today. So my name is Jody Bechtel, and I'm the Deputy Director for Clark County's Department of Environment and Sustainability. We're here today to talk about rule development for a state implementation plan submission requirements for moderate non-attainment of the 2015 Ozone National Ambient Air Quality Standard. And again, we are here as our Division of Air Quality, or DAQ, as you will hear us talk about ourselves. There we go. So DAQ and our department serve as the air pollution control agency for Clark County. And on this screen just shows some of the main people involved in this attainment effort and rulemaking process. So in January of this year, we had a public meeting discussing our ozone situation and the efforts that we will be undertaking this year to address this moderate non-attainment situation. I encourage you to watch that video or review the presentations. That was from January 12th. For the specifics, I'm just going to go over some really high-level information background at this time. So for the Las Vegas Valley, formerly Hydrographic Area 212 or HA 212, we were in marginal non-attainment for ozone when the standard was at 0.075 parts per million, with a current standard of 0.070 parts per million. We have been bumped up to moderate non-attainment, and again have to develop this state implementation plan to identify ways and actions that will get us back into attainment. And I also am noting for folks on the call that the EPA is reviewing the ozone standard, and that could be lowered again, in which case we could be looking at a serious non-attainment situation if we're unable to get our emissions below the standard. So as part of the state implementation plan development, we must establish emission control requirements, and we are required to review reasonably available control technology, or RACT, requirements on area sources. We are required to come up with a 15% rate of progress and reduce volatile organic compounds by 15%, independent of any reductions necessary for attainment. And we are required to come up with contingency measures that would be triggered if we aren't able to meet the attainment by August of 2024. And this table is just showing you the different rules and where they apply in those actions. So the different rules that we're considering promulgating to meet this SIP requirement. So this table identifies the statutory timelines that we're working under. Again, it's kind of a fast-paced, critical timeline. We were notified on the 5th of January this year that our SIP submission deadline was the 1st of January of this year. So again, it is a retroactive deadline. We are in a scramble to get any actions identified and in place as soon as possible. And so the ROP, via the 15% reduction in volatile organic compounds, is to be completed by December of this year, and attainment will be evaluated in August of 2024. Again, so we're working as expeditiously as possible to get some rules in place that would help reduce some of our emissions. If we are unable to meet the deadlines or get these controls in place, obviously we can't meet the deadlines. If we're unable to respond in a timely manner, EPA could start a sanctions clock, which could lead to loss of federal highway funds and other penalties, and allow EPA to enact a federal implementation plan and control requirements on our community, excuse me, which we would like to avoid. So our first stakeholder meetings, again, were in January and February. Those are available on our website. That website is listed here at the bottom of this slide. It's posted in the chat. I encourage you all to go back through those if you're interested in some of that back information. Otherwise, these presentations listed here for the dates that we will be doing them will also be recorded and posted on the website. So people who are unable to participate or would like to review what was discussed, you can review those again. So with that, we are going to be talking about miscellaneous metal and plastic parts, and I will turn the presentation over to Lynn Hutchison with RTP.
Okay, everyone seeing my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. Okay, so EPA has issued 2 CTG control technique guidelines that DAQ needed to consider in establishing its CTG RAC rules. The first of those was issued all the way back in 1978, and the second one, which really was just an update to the first one, was issued in 2008. You can find these CTG guideline documents on EPA's website. There was also a link to the documents in the first workshop series that we did. The regulated CTG source category includes hundreds of different kinds of manufacturing operations, and EPA generally described those operations as falling in major group stationary industrial classification codes 33 to 41, and I've listed those here for you to see the kinds of operations that would be covered by this CTG RAC rule. The kinds of things that are done within these SIC codes, you've got fabricated metal production, metal pipes, electronics equipment. Particularly in Clark County, you might have casino machines, might be something that would fall into these categories. I'm not going to go over these slides. They were in the first presentation. I just kept them in here for reference materials. So the CTG RACT rule would apply to stationary sources with a potential to emit equal to or greater than 3 tons per year of VOC from the miscellaneous metal parts or plastic coating operations. So if you have multiple things going on at your stationary source, you don't need to include the emissions of, for example, car manufacturing in this CTG. It's only the things that would qualify under miscellaneous metal parts and coating operations that would go against that 3 ton per year level. The stationary source would also have to be located in an area that the US EPA has designated non-attainment for an ozone standard, and classified that area as moderate or higher in its classification. So as Jody mentioned, right now, hydrogeographic area 212 meets those qualifications, and this rule would apply in that area. If EPA were to establish a new ozone standard and make new designations that increase the geographic area that standard applies to, and also classified the area as moderate or higher, then this CTG RAC rule would apply to you. The rule provides some full and some partial exemptions from the requirements of the rule. A full exemption would mean that you have nothing that you need to do under the standard, while a partial exemption would only provide you an exception to certain requirements in the rule. The first 3 categories listed on here are full exemptions. So if you are applying coatings to a test panel or coupon, or using coatings in research and development, quality control, or performance evaluations, or applying coatings using non-refillable handheld aerosol spray containers, you would be exempt from the rule. The next exemption is for those facilities that might be subject to a different RAC standard, CTG RAC rule that we've gone over today. You would be exempt from the rule if you had to comply with a different RAC standard. If you have to comply with a Part 60, 61, or 63 standard that is promulgated after Obviously, I copied my slides from other slides, so let me change that here too. That should say 2008. Or a Part 59 standard. You would be exempt from emission controls and VOC content limit requirements when you're conducting certain activities. And this slide breaks those activities out, as does EPA's presumptive RACT rule, into those activities limited to metal parts coating and those that are limited to plastic part coating. So these are a list of activities that you can undertake without complying with the emission controls and VOC content limits in the rule. Finally, the rule also provides an exemption from the emissions control requirements and permitting requirements of the rule if you emitted less than 3 tons per year of VOC from miscellaneous metal parts and plastic coating operations in the past 3 consecutive calendar years. So that's 3 tons of VOC. Put that in there on the fly here. And also it contains a material use exception. If you're using less than 815 gallons of VOC containing material, and that's a generic name for your coatings and your cleaning solvents per calendar year, then you would be exempt from the emission controls and permitting requirements of this rule. You would still need to comply with the work practice requirements. Instead of meeting the permitting requirements of the rule, you would have to submit an annual notice requirement to report your annual emissions or material use. Along with that, you would have to record keep that material use and have it available on site should a control officer ask for that documentation. The rule would exempt certain activities from having to use the efficient application methods requirements in the rule. Again, here is a list. The left-hand side of the list applies to metal or plastic parts coating, whereas the right side of the list is for automotive, transportation, and business machine coating. Just leave that up there for a second so you can look at it. Okay, so now those are all the exemptions. Let's talk about what the rule requires. If you're an owner and operator with a miscellaneous metal or plastic part coating operations that are not otherwise exempt, then the operations will have to meet emission reduction and other requirements under the rules. There are 3 ways in which you can meet the emission reduction and requirements of the rule. The first option involves complying with VOC content limits for the coatings on a mass per volume basis of coating, mass of a volume of coating. It also includes requirements to use specific application methods and follow the work practice requirements in the rule. If you attended our first set of seminars, you might recognize these slides. We have not changed them since the initial workshop, and these are straight out of EPA's CTG rule, and we would be applying the same limits on a volume per coating basis. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on these. I'll just put them up and let you see them. These are, again, straight out of the CTG RACT rule. Okay, the second option would require equivalent VOC emissions reductions by using a combination of VOC content limits and an add-on emission control system. And these would be, this emission control requirement would be expressed in terms of a mass of VOC per volume of coating solids. So the other one was a volume of the coating total. This would be based on volume of coating solids. And again, these requirements are straight out of EPA's CTG guideline document. The third option would be to use only an emission control system. And if you do that, you need to meet an overall control efficiency of 90%, and then also comply with the work practice requirements. You would not need to comply with the efficient application methods if you're using the emission control system. So what are the efficient application requirements? These are basic things that almost everyone uses in practice today: electrostatic application, high volume, low pressure spraying. And I won't spend a lot of time going through this whole list, but these are pretty standard in practice at sources today. Work practice requirements. If you've been with us since the beginning of this workshop today, you'll recognize a lot of these. We've repeated them for almost all of the source categories. You're going to need to store your VOC containing materials, thinners, and coating related waste in closed, non-absorbent, non-leaking containers. You're going to need to label those containers if they're larger than 1 gallon in size with the name of the product that's in the container. You're going to need to close mixing and storage containers when they're not in use. Convey VOC containing material in closed containers or pipes. Store your cleaning materials, captured solvent, and used rags in closed containers. Promptly repair leaks and clean up any spills immediately. Contain them and clean them up. Avoid atomizing cleaning solvents when you're cleaning your equipment. And as with the other source categories, we're asking that you conduct quarterly inspections of the work area to make sure that the lids are being closed while containers are not in use, and the other work practice requirements are being followed. Train your new employees and repeat the training annually. We think that's probably the best way that you can assure that these things are complied with in practice. There will be a permitting requirement for sources subject to this rule. So if you have a PTE greater than 3 tons per year and you're not otherwise exempt, then you are going to need to submit a permit application within 180 days of the effective date of the rule. And that could be a minor source permit if you're not subject to any permitting now. It could be a revision to an authority to construct permit that's already been issued to you, or a Part 70 permit that's already been issued to you. New operations are going to have to submit a permit application before they actually begin construction. Now, I want to make clear that this permitting obligation applies to you regardless of the current applicability thresholds of the permitting program, and irrespective of what might apply to you because of those permitting programs under Section 12 of the rules. So, for example, if you are an existing source and you are not currently subject to permitting, but you undertake a new modification to your facility that's going to bring you into this rule, you're going to have VOC emissions that are going to be regulated under this rule. You need to submit a permit application, even if you wouldn't have to do so under the permitting rules. But if you are also having PM emissions, which are not regulated by this rule, this rule deals only with VOC emissions, but let's say your modification also hits the applicability trigger of the permitting program, you have to also comply with those requirements. So this permitting requirement in this rule is an add-on to the existing permitting requirements. You need to comply with both. Permits will include the monitoring, record keeping, and reporting requirements necessary to assure compliance with this rule. Now, DAQ hopes to make this very streamlined in practice and to have a general permit ready to go by the time permit applications are due. But we're not guaranteeing that at this point. So this permit obligation applies irrespective of the availability of a general permit. But if there's a general permit available, you're more than welcome to apply for coverage under that general permit. Compliance dates. Different dates for existing versus new facilities. An existing facility is going to have to begin to comply at 180 days after the effective date of the rule. If you begin construction before the effective date of the rule, but haven't started operations yet, you're going to get to the delay compliance until you begin normal operations. New sources, you have to, as I said, comply with the permitting requirement before you begin actual construction. But then you won't have to actually comply with the substantive requirements of the rule until you've commenced normal operations. And stationary sources need to comply with these rules by these dates, regardless of whether DAQ has issued you a final permit. So you have to submit your permit application within 180 days, but that's the same day you need to comply with the rule if you're existing source. So compliance with this rule is independent of when DAQ actually gets that permit issued to you. So make sure you're using the right VOC content limits and or an emissions control device or combination of the two systems by that 180-day time frame. There are some exceptions to these general compliance deadlines. There is a sell-through provision in the rule for existing operations only, not new operations. On the effective date of the rule, you cannot buy non-compliant material unless you're using an emission control system to control emissions from that material. But if you have existing inventory of non-compliant materials, you may use those materials up until 12 months after the effective date of the rule without complying with the rule. So 12 months for your existing inventory. Another exception for existing operations, we realize that these rules have been fast-tracked and DAQ may not be fully aware of everything that an individual stationary source needs to do to comply by that 180-day deadline. So if you find yourself unable to comply with the deadline, in your permit application, you may request an alternative deadline. You need to justify that that's the amount of time that you need and that you are unable to comply by the deadline and provide those reasons. That proposed deadline will apply to you until DAQ acts on your application and sets an alternative deadline or denies your request. And I think that pretty much sums it up for this particular rule. I will turn it back over to Araceli.
Thank you, Lynn. Now's the time for questions. If you have any questions, please raise your hand or post them in the chat. I'm not seeing any questions. I'll go ahead and talk about our next steps in the rulemaking timeline. So again, here's our rulemaking timeline for those of you who were on the call or in previous sessions. Today's the workshop day of July 10th. We are holding additional workshop for other rulemakings associated with our ozone attainment plan on July 13th, this Thursday. We would start the 30-day public comment period on September 3rd, and that would end on October 3rd. We will be taking the rule to the Board of County Commissioners for a public hearing and rule adoption on November 21st, and the rule would become effective 2 weeks later on December 5th. Compliance dates are specific to each rule and are based on the rule effective dates. And Lynn touched on those in her presentation. Next steps are we will consider comments received today and any additional written comments received by July 27th. We would appreciate any written comments that you can provide us to help us get this rule right before we release it to the public on September 3rd. You can send your comments to me directly. Again, the proposed rule will be released for 30-day public notice and comment, followed by a public hearing for final adoption. Those who have registered for our mailing list will receive updates on the developments of these rules, as well as our ozone attainment plan. You can follow the development of this effort using the web link provided. I also posted links in the chat to the proposed rules, the registration page, and our ozone webpage. And just in summary, we'd like to let you know that we're going to continue to engage both stakeholders and the public in our rulemaking efforts and our ozone attainment efforts. Any questions can be directed to myself or Zheng Li if you have any modeling questions. Again, I just want to encourage everybody to submit any written comments you have on the rules that we have presented by July 27th, and to sign up